I want to be clear before this board asks me anything else that I did not request the incident review. Director Imrek Salos requested it. He filed the complaint 2 days after the containment event, and I assume he expected the review to go a certain way. I am telling you now, in the interest of saving everyone's time, that it will not go that way. I have been doing this for 31 years. I know what happened in that pen. I know why it happened, and I am prepared to describe it in whatever detail this board requires. My name is Soren Havoc. I hold no current rank. My last military designation was Senior Garrison Specialist, Frontier Division, 3rd Reach, retired with commendation 11 years ago after a containment incident on Vorrakh Station that is relevant to today's discussion only, in the sense that it is the reason I know anything useful about the Vorrakh. Prior to that posting, I had 17 years of garrison service across 8 frontier installations. I have been inside more containment pens, biological holding wards, and live specimen transit corridors than I could count accurately. I left the garrison because I was offered a pension and because the work I wanted to do, the work that I am good at, the garrison did not value the way I believed it should be valued. There are people who are good at managing large predators through force of protocol. I am not one of them. There are people who are good at managing large predators through patience and observation, and the kind of stillness that takes years to learn. I am one of those people. The garrison wanted the first kind. So I left, and I found contract work that let me do it the second way. Since leaving the garrison, I have worked civilian contract as a pen monitor and animal behavior consultant for 7 different facilities across 6 transit hubs, ranging from the inner belt stations to the far reach of the Vorrakh corridor. My posting record is clean. I have had no serious injuries, no containment failures. I have had 3 formal disputes with station directors in 11 years, all of which were resolved in my favor, and the resolution of which I mention not to suggest I am difficult to work with, but to establish that disagreement with station management is not new to me, and that when it happens I tend to be the one who has the better argument. My posting at the time of the incident, since I understand Director Salos has also filed for my reassignment, was outer. Station Vorrakh, Containment Ward B, Vorrakh Holding Unit. I was hired 14 months ago. The Vorrakh pack was already in residence. There were 4 of them, an adult alpha designated Unit 1 in the station's ledger, and 3 juveniles designated Units 2, 3, and 4. The alpha was a mature male, roughly 800 pounds, 6-limb slate-banded gray hide over a frame like a collapsed building. The slate banding, the lighter gray stripes that run across the darker field, was particularly sharp on him, which I understand is an indicator of primate vitality in their species. He had the full breadth of retractable dew claws on all 6 limbs, which at his size meant claws the length of my forearm, though he kept them sheathed in the presence of the juveniles, unless there was a specific reason to deploy them. The 3 juveniles were between 1 and 2 years of age at the time I arrived, the size of large working animals, though that comparison does them no justice, because working animals do not have retractable dew claws on all 6 limbs, and they do not have the kind of eyes that make you feel like you are being accurately inventoried. Amber eyes. The Vorrakh have amber eyes, all of them, and they have a quality in the iris that is difficult to describe in a formal deposition. It is not hostility. It is not curiosity in the casual sense. It is something more like measurement. They are doing arithmetic about you that you will never see the results of. You know it is happening. You know the calculation is continuous. You do not know the denominator. The previous pen monitor had lasted 6 weeks. The one before that had lasted 11 days. I am not saying this to suggest that the work is particularly dangerous for someone who understands it. I am saying it because the station had a problem by the time I arrived, which was that the Vorrakh pack had decided it did not like the people being sent in to manage it, and the facilities division had run through their available list of licensed handlers. I came as a last option. Director Salos made that plain in our first meeting. He told me, with the specific brand of professional courtesy that means the opposite of courtesy, that he expected me to establish provisional behavioral compliance within 30 days, and that if I could not demonstrate measurable progress by the end of that window, he would petition to have the pack sedated and shipped to a research facility on Cost Station that specialized in what he called aggressive containment methodology. I did not ask him to define aggressive containment methodology. I already knew what it meant. It meant that the pack's behavioral problems would be resolved through repeated aversive stimulation and physical constraint, until the pack learned to associate human presence with pain, and then they would comply, not because they were calm, not because they had decided anything, but because they had been conditioned to understand that resistance meant suffering. It works, in the sense that the pack stops being visibly dangerous. The pack is also afterward a different thing than it was before, smaller, in some way that has nothing to do with size. I have seen it done. I did not want to see it done to this pack. I told Director Salos I understood his timeline and his requirements. I did not tell him what I thought of the contingency plan. I told him I understood, and I went to work. The first thing I did was nothing. I want the board to understand this, because it will become relevant later. My methodology with an unknown pack, and with the Vorrakh specifically, based on my prior experience with one juvenile male on Vorrakh Station, is to spend the first period of a posting doing nothing that the pack does, not initiate. I do not approach, I do not offer food, I do not use contact protocols, I do not issue behavioral commands, I do not attempt to establish dominance hierarchy through any of the methods that are listed as standard procedure in the Facilities Division Manual, because the Facilities Division Manual was written by people who have never been in a pen with a Vorrakh and survived long enough to write anything useful afterward. The manual covers the Vorrakh in a supplemental appendix that runs to 4 pages. 4 pages on an apex pack predator with the most sophisticated social cognition I have encountered in 30 years of this work. The 4 pages are mostly warnings. Ice outside the containment barrier. The barrier on Ward B is a membrane type, permeable to air and sound, not to mass, and it gives a clear view into the pen in both directions. I sat outside it and I let the pack see me sitting there. I sat there for 4 hours the first day, in a folding chair that I brought from the equipment room. I ate my lunch outside the barrier. I did not look directly at the alpha. I did not make myself large or small. I did not have any documentation in my hands. Because documentation in your hands means your attention is divided, and undivided attention is a specific kind of signal in pack predator social dynamics. I sat, and I ate, and I was completely available to be observed, and when the 4 hours were done I left. I did this for 9 days. On the first and second days the pack stayed in the rear of the pen. On the third day the alpha descended from his elevated platform twice to look at me, and returned to the platform both times. On the 5th day the largest juvenile, I would later name him Kale, though his station designation was Unit 2, came to the near side of the pen and sat approximately 15 feet inside the barrier, watching me eat. He left after about 20 minutes. On the 7th and 8th days the pack was unremarkable. On the 9th day, toward the end of my observation window, the alpha descended from the platform and walked a slow circuit of the pen, not approaching the barrier, but moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace that I have come to understand is a form of territorial demonstration that is not aggressive. It is more like narration. This is my space. I know you are here. I am telling you that I know. I acknowledged it by looking at a point on the far wall and staying still until he was back on the platform. On the 10th day, the smallest juvenile, the one I would later name Thresh, though her station designation was Unit 4, pressed her nose against the inside of the barrier membrane and held it there for approximately 40 seconds while I ate my lunch. The membrane dimpled under the pressure of her nose. I did not move. I did not acknowledge it directly. I finished my lunch, sat for the remainder of my scheduled observation window, and left. I have to explain why this was significant, because the board may not find it significant in itself, and they would be wrong not to find it significant. The Vorrakh nose press is a contact-seeking behavior. It is an extension of the olfactory mapping that the Vorrakh use to categorize everything in their environment. When she pressed her nose against the membrane toward me, she was not attempting to breach containment. She was trying to gather information about me at closer range than the open pen observation distance had afforded her for the previous 9 days. It means she had decided I was worth closer investigation. After 10 days of sitting outside a pen, being decided worth closer investigation by a Vorrakh juvenile is a meaningful outcome. It is not a small thing. On the 14th day, Thresh was sitting against the inside of the barrier membrane when I arrived, and she stayed there for the full observation window. The other 2 juveniles, who I had begun thinking of as Kale and Drum, Unit 2 and Unit 3, were in the back of the pen near the Alpha's platform. The Alpha was on his elevated platform, watching me the way you watch a stranger who has not done anything wrong yet but might. He did this in absolute stillness, the subsonic baseline rumble running at its normal ambient level, which on a Vorrakh Alpha sounds less like a sound and more like a pressure change in the air around you. It sits in your sternum. After 31 years in this work, I find it comforting. In the early years, I did not. On the 19th day, the observation window in the barrier was unlocked by station protocol for feeding. I entered the pen with the food allocation, raw protein provisions, weighed to the pack's nutritional specifications, in 4 marked portions for the 3 juveniles and 1 for the... Thresh was waiting 6 feet inside the entrance. I set the juvenile portions near the entry area, which is standard. Let the juveniles eat near the door so the alpha can eat at center pen without competition for space. I set the portions down. Thresh ate from the nearest one. The other 2 juveniles came from the back and ate from theirs. I stood still. The alpha descended from his platform, crossed half the pen, stopped 12 feet from me and sat. He sat, and he looked at me, and I looked at a point slightly above and to the left of his head, which is the correct response when a Vorrakh Alpha is establishing whether you intend to compete with him for anything. The slightly off-axis look acknowledges his presence without claiming equal visual authority. It says, "I see you, but I am not challenging you. I am waiting for you to decide what I am." We held that arrangement for about 3 minutes. The juveniles finished eating. The alpha's rumble maintained its baseline steady state throughout. Then he went and ate his portion in the center of the pen, and when he was done I went and sat against the far wall, and the 3 juveniles came and arranged themselves within a few feet of me. Thresh, directly to my left, Kale slightly behind my left shoulder, Drum facing outward from my right in a loose guardian position, and that was how feeding, window visitations went from that point forward. By the end of the first 30 days, I had established what the facilities division would classify as behavioral compliance. I would classify it differently. I would classify it as a mutual acknowledgement. The pack had decided that I was not a threat, and was not competition, and was not interesting as prey, and that the space I occupied in the pen was acceptable to them. That is different from compliance. Compliance implies that the pack is doing what I want. What was actually happening was that they had decided what I was, and they had decided it was something they could tolerate, and their behavior reflected that decision, not mine. I reported progress to Director Salos at the 30-day mark. He seemed disappointed that there was nothing dramatic to report, which I noted but did not comment on. He asked me to describe what measurable behavioral improvements I had made. I told him the pack was stable, that feeding windows were proceeding without incident, and that I had begun extended in-pen observation periods. He asked me if I had implemented the contact protocols from the manual. I told him I had not found them necessary. He asked me what I meant by that. I told him I meant that the pack was stable without them, and that introducing a protocol that was not necessary seemed like introducing a variable without a purpose. He looked at me for a moment, and then he wrote something in his ledger. And then he told me he would be scheduling a formal review of methodology at the 60-day mark. That review also did not go well, from the director's perspective. By the 60-day mark, I had been eating lunch in the pen 3 times per week. I had begun bringing secondary provisions, items from the station's organic stores that were not in the pack's official dietary allocation, but that I had assessed as non-harmful and nutritionally adjacent to their natural prey profile. I brought these not as training rewards, but because I found that eating alongside the pack, sharing the space of a meal, accelerated the process of what I am calling mutual acknowledgement. Thresh, in particular, had developed a habit of sitting close enough to me during these sessions that our shared body heat was perceptible. She was the smallest of the 3 juveniles, and she ran warmer than her siblings. The Vorrakh thermoregulate actively, and the juveniles run warmer than adults, which means sitting against a juvenile Vorrakh on a cold station morning is genuinely pleasant, in the way that sitting against any large warm animal is pleasant. Which is something I mention only because it became part of the director's complaint later, and I would like to establish now that it was operationally unremarkable. The 3 juveniles were following me to the pen entrance at the end of each feeding window, which I had not arranged and which was not listed anywhere in the facilities division manual as a desired behavioral outcome, and the alpha had begun making what I can only describe as a courtesy gesture when I entered, a lowering of the chin toward the ground and a brief cessation of his baseline subsonic chest rumble, which the Vorrakh used to maintain ambient pack awareness. It meant he had acknowledged me entering his space. This is, in the behavioral taxonomy of the Vorrakh, a significant thing. They do not acknowledge what they do not consider relevant. I know of 3 other documented instances of a Vorrakh alpha performing a chin lowering acknowledgement toward a non-Vorrakh individual, and in 2 of those cases, the individual was another large predator species. The 3rd case involved a garrison sergeant on Outer Reach who had spent 4 years working with the pack, and who described the gesture in a personal letter, not in any official report, because he said he did not think anyone who hadn't seen it would believe him. I believe him. I have seen it. I did not explain this to Director Salos in full at the 60-day review, because I did not think it would be received well. I told him the pack was stable and progressing normally. He told me he would continue to evaluate. I thanked him and went back to work. Over the following months, the pack's behavior continued to develop in ways that I was tracking carefully, because what was happening was unusual enough that I wanted to document it, even if I was the only one who would ever read the documentation. The 3 juveniles had distinct personalities, which I want to note because the Facilities Division ledger records them only as Unit 2, Unit 3, and Unit 4, and I think this is inadequate to what they actually are. Kale, Unit 2, was the deliberate one. Everything he did after a pause. When I moved in the pen, he watched the movement complete before he adjusted his own position. When I spoke, I began speaking aloud in the pen around the 4th month. Not commands, just talk. Because I had found early in my career that consistent calm speech from a handler builds acoustic familiarity faster than silence. Kale would angle his head to catch the sound, processing it with what I can only describe as apparent consideration. He was the one who had settled into the habit of positioning himself behind my left shoulder, which I have already described to the board, and which I will come back to. He was also the largest of the 3 juveniles by the 9-month mark, approximately 340 pounds, long-limbed and precise in his movements. Drum, Unit 3, was the watchful one. While the other 2 engaged with me directly, Drum almost always faced outward. He ate facing the entry membrane. He slept facing the corner that covered the largest field of view in the pen. When the 3 of them were arranged near me during feeding windows, Drum's position was consistently the one that covered the approach angle, most likely to be used by anything coming through the membrane. I did not teach him this. It was simply where he went, every time, without variation. By the 8-month mark, I had stopped thinking of it as coincidence. Thresh, Unit 4, was the one who initiated. Every behavioral shift in the pack's relationship with me began with something Thresh did first. The nose press at the barrier, the sustained proximity during feeding, the approach to the far wall where I sat. She was also the smallest, which may sound counterintuitive as a description for the one who went first, but if I have found across 31 years that it is often the smallest who goes first, because the smallest has to pay more attention to the dynamics of a space in order to be safe in it, and that attention makes them quicker to read the edges where safety and engagement begin to overlap. I am giving the board this detail about their individual characters because I want to be precise about what was in that pen before the cast team arrived. It was not simply a contained pack of apex predators in a holding facility. It was a working relationship 14 months in the making, built on observation and patience and mutual assessment, and what the cast team walked into was not a neutral behavioral environment. They walked into a space that had an established social structure, and in that social structure I held a position that the pack had assigned to me, and the cast's presence was an intrusion into that structure. I want the board to understand that what happened during the evaluation was not random, and it was not an equipment failure, and it was not a methodology failure. It was the pack responding to a change in their social environment in exactly the way a healthy, cognitively sophisticated apex predator pack would respond to such a change. The still water protocol, as the juveniles had taken to calling it in their behavioral pattern, and I am using that phrase loosely, because the Vorrakh do not use language, but they do use behavioral signaling that functions as shared protocol within the pack, had developed around month 8. I had a routine when I entered the pen. I would stand just inside the entrance for approximately 60 seconds, still and quiet, orienting to the space before I moved through it. This is something I have done for years. It is not a contact protocol. It is a personal habit developed from garrison work, where entering an unfamiliar space without a moment of stillness gets you killed. You stop. You listen. You let the space show you what it is before you move through it. It saved my life 3 times on the frontier, and I have not stopped doing it since. The juveniles began doing it with me. When I entered and stood still, they would position themselves nearby and also stand still for the same duration before moving. They were precise about it. The threshold for the still period was about 50 to 60 seconds. If I moved at 50 seconds, they moved at 50 seconds. If I held longer, they held longer. Kale in particular had developed a habit of positioning himself slightly behind my left shoulder during the stillness period, Thresh beside my left side, Drum facing outward on my right, the three of them in their positions and all of us still, and then the movement beginning together when I moved. I mentioned this behavioral pattern in a written report to the Facilities Division. At the 10-month mark, I described it as a synchronized ambient awareness display and noted it as an indicator of deep social integration. The Facilities Division acknowledged receipt of the report. The director called me to his office 2 days later and asked me what I meant by deep social integration. I explained the pattern. He asked me if I was describing training the pack or being trained by the pack. I told him the distinction was probably less important than the outcome, which was that the pack was stable, cooperative during feeding and observation, and had not injured or threatened a station staff member in 14 months. He did not like this answer. 2 weeks later, he informed me that he had engaged the services of a cast handler team to conduct a formal behavioral assessment of the pack and of my methodology. I want to describe the casts to the board, because some members may not have direct experience with them. The casts are licensed predator handlers operating out of the Vorrakh transit corridor and several neighboring stations. They have an established reputation. They are 4-limbed bipedal species, tall, heavily built, with a natural pheromone signature that functions as a mild aversive stimulus on most pack predator species. They use this pheromone signature as a contact tool. It is part of their documented methodology, and it is effective on the species they are certified for. Their certification list includes 14 distinct apex predator species, which is a substantial list. The methodology that produces those certifications is based on a philosophy of pack hierarchy assertion through biological dominance signals, which is a valid approach for species whose social cognition is organized around chemical hierarchy markers. The Vorrakh are not organized around chemical hierarchy markers. They are organized around observed behavioral authority. The distinction matters because behavioral authority is not something you can emit from a wrist emitter. You have to earn it through action, and you have to earn it over time, and you have to earn it in a way that the pack can observe and assess and decide to accept. I do not know the cast team's certification list. I know it does not include the Vorrakh, because no one has a formal Vorrakh certification as of the date of this incident, for reasons that should be obvious from the incident record you currently have in front of you. I knew this when Director Salos told me about the engagement, and I asked him whether the cast team had been briefed on the specific behavioral characteristics of this pack. The director told me the cast were professionals with extensive experience, and that briefing them on the pack was the purpose of the evaluation, not a prerequisite for it. I told him I had some observations about the pack's current behavioral state that might be useful context for the cast team before they entered the pen. The director told me the cast would conduct their own pre-interaction assessment, which was part of their standard methodology. I said I understood. The evaluation was scheduled for the third feeding window of the day, which is late afternoon by station time. I arrived early, as I always do, and I completed my pre-window routine, approached the observation corridor, checked the barrier status, gave the pack their advance awareness time, which is my term for the period before I enter when I let the pen adjust to my presence outside it. I have found that 15 minutes of standing in the corridor before a feeding window, doing nothing, reduces the entry adjustment behavior in the pack by approximately 70%. The pack has time to register me, to complete whatever behavioral conversations they are having about the fact of my presence, and to settle into the expectation of the window before it begins. They are not surprised by my entrance. Surprise in an apex predator pack is not a condition you want to produce unnecessarily. The juveniles had moved to the near side of the pen when I arrived at the observation corridor. Thresh was doing her nose-to-barrier contact, which she does when she knows I am about to come in. I had long since stopped thinking of this as remarkable. The alpha was on his platform, sitting in his way, absolutely still, taking inventory of the station's morning through the pen's upper ventilation, his rumble at baseline. Everything was normal. Director Salosas arrived with the cast team at the start of the window. Rathosel was in front. He was the tallest of them by some margin, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from having worked large predators for a long time and not died. He wore the cast team's working kit, which is a standardized outer garment in a dark neutral color, equipment fitted, with the wrist mount pheromone delivery system visible on the left limb. His 3 colleagues were similarly equipped. All 4 of them held their body language correctly for a predator-facing entry, compact, deliberate, no sudden movement. They knew their craft. Rath Ossel's second colleague took a position at the right side of the observation corridor and began a low-voiced status assessment. He was reading the pack's ambient posture and spacing before any contact was initiated. That is a correct instinct. The third and fourth colleagues fanned slightly to cover the full width of the corridor view into the pen, and then the pack's ambient behavior changed. Thresh pulled back from the barrier membrane. That was the first thing. She had been doing her nose contact, warm against the inner surface, and she stopped and retreated about 6 feet and stood watching. Not watching the corridor generally, watching the cast. The distinction was clear to me because for 14 months I had been watching her eyes, and the way she tracked a person was not the way she tracked a space. She tracked the cast. Kale and Drum moved from their positions in the pen to flank the Alpha's platform. The Alpha descended from the platform, which he does not do unless he has decided something requires his direct attention, and positioned himself in the center of the pen, facing the observation corridor. Rath Ossels watched this and made a note in his assessment ledger. He described it, in his verbal summary to Director Salos during the assessment, as a standard threat assessment posture. He was correct that it was an assessment posture. Whether the threat designation was accurate was what the following 14 minutes resolved. Director Salos was watching from the corridor with visible satisfaction. I was standing at the back of the corridor, against the far wall, in what I had come to understand was my spot. The position the pack had mapped me to. The place in the corridor where I always stood when I was observing from outside the pen. Thresh, before she pulled back from the barrier, had been positioned adjacent to where I was standing, on the inside of the membrane. Now she was 6 feet back, watching the cast, but her body angle was not perfectly aligned to the cast. It was slightly angled toward me. She was tracking both of us simultaneously, which is something the Vorrakh do when they are assessing a situation that involves multiple parties. I noticed this, and I stayed very still, because I had been in this kind of situation before, on other stations, and I knew that the still water that I had tried to maintain in that corridor was about to be tested, and I was going to hold it regardless. Rath Ossel initiated entry protocol. He announced to the room, myself, the director, his colleagues, and by extension the pack, that he would be conducting a controlled introduction using standard cast pheromone contact methodology, and that the pack's response would be assessed over a 15-minute interaction window. He was professional and precise in his language, and I want the board to note that. Whatever followed, it did not follow because Rath Ossel was careless or incompetent. He was a skilled handler doing exactly what he had been trained to do, in an environment that his training had not prepared him for, because no one's training had prepared for it. This was not a failure of his ability. It was a failure of category. He opened the barrier membrane. Thresh moved immediately, not toward the cast, toward me. She came across the pens at a pace that was not alarming. It was not a charge. It was a purposeful crossing, the kind of movement you see from a pack member who has decided where they want to be and is going there. And she pressed herself against the barrier membrane from the inside, directly adjacent to my position in the corridor. The membrane curved slightly with her weight against it. I felt the warmth through the material, the same warmth I had sat next to every feeding window for more than a year. She was not looking at the cast anymore. She was looking at me. Kale moved from his position and crossed to a point in the pen that put him between the open entry membrane and the place where I was standing, against the back wall of the corridor. Not at the membrane, not visible to Rath Ossel, who was standing just inside. Kale placed himself in the interior of the pen in the spatial position that covered the approach angle from the entry point to my spot in the corridor. If something came through that entry membrane toward where I was standing, it would encounter Kale first. He had done this calculation and arrived at his position without any signal that I observed. Drum took a position that mirrored Kale on the opposite side, covering the second approach angle, and the Alpha stood in the center of the pen and looked at Rath Ossel. Rath Ossel had paused his entry when Thresh moved. He was a professional. He recalibrated. He looked at Thresh against the membrane adjacent to my position. He looked at Kale. He looked at Drum. He was reading the pack's spatial arrangement, which is what a good handler does, and I could see from his posture that he was arriving at a calculation. I do not know exactly what that calculation produced, but I know that he looked at me once, directly, for approximately 2 seconds, before he looked back at the Alpha. The Alpha lowered his head to a level position. I want to be explicit about this for the board, because the incident report uses the phrase aggressive stance, and that is imprecise. When a Vorrakh Alpha lowers his head to the level position, not chin to ground, which is the acknowledgement gesture, but the specific position where the line of the skull is horizontal with the ground, he is making himself flat to the horizon. This is the territorial challenge posture. It is unambiguous in the Vorrakh behavioral literature. Even in the limited 4-page supplement in the Facilities Division Manual, it means, I am aware of your presence in my space. I am telling you that I am the authority in this space. I'm waiting to see whether you will accept that fact. Rathasel held his position. He did not advance, and he did not retreat, and I will acknowledge that was the correct response. He said something to his colleagues in cast speech that I do not speak, but which his nearest colleague later translated for me as a request to hold position and maintain current formation. The Alpha took a step toward Rath Ossel, slow, deliberate. The rumble shifted, not to the staccato aggressive pulse, but to the sustained territorial maintenance tone, which is a different thing, and which I want to be clear about, because the incident report conflates them. The territorial maintenance tone says, I am maintaining the fact of my authority in this space. The aggressive pulse says, I am about to act. The Alpha was not about to act, he was narrating. Rath Ossel held. The Alpha took another step, the sustained tone continued. The second Keth colleague had moved subtly from his suspense position to a position slightly to the Alpha's flank, which I recognized immediately as a standard pack disruption approach. It is a technique that works on several Apex-class pack predators. Present a lateral stimulus to break the Alpha's focused attention on the primary handler, creating an opportunity to re-establish the interaction dynamic. It works on species whose lateral awareness has gaps, or whose pack communication relies on direct vocalization. The Vorrakh's 6-limbed structure means their lateral awareness has no gaps, and their pack communication is subsonic. The rumble, which propagates through the air and through the floor simultaneously, carries information that a Vorrakh can receive without looking. Drum was on the far side of the pen, and he registered the second colleague's lateral movement before the second colleague had completed 3 steps. Drum rotated on his axis, all 6 limbs repositioning in a smooth pivot, and faced the flanking approach. The second colleague stopped. There was approximately 20 seconds in which the room held its arrangement. The Alpha at the center of the pen, Rath Ossel just inside the entry, Kale between the entry and my position, Thresh against the membrane beside me, Drum facing the second colleague's approach, the third and fourth cast colleagues in the observation corridor, Director Salos against the corridor wall with his ledger, me at the back of the corridor, very still. I want to note for the board that during this 20-second period I did not speak, signal, or in any way communicate with the pack. I was standing in my spot holding the kind of stillness I had spent 31 years learning to hold. Whatever the pack was doing, they were doing it on their own assessment of the situation. Rath Ossel made the decision to activate his pheromone delivery. I understand why. He had a pack that was not responding to his presence, that had not submitted to his entry, that was occupying a spatial arrangement he had not been able to disrupt, and he had been in the pen for 5 minutes, with no progress toward the behavioral assessment objectives he had been contracted to demonstrate. The pheromone delivery was his primary tool. It had worked on 14 certified species. He used it. I saw the decision cross his face before I saw him move his arm. The wrist mount emitter has a specific mechanical tell, a small preparatory rotation of the limb that brings the emitter to the forward-facing orientation, and I had seen enough equipment of that type to recognize the motion. I did not call out to stop him. I want the board to be clear on that. I did not intervene. I did not attempt to stop the evaluation. I had been told I was present as an observer, and I observed. What I did do, in the approximately 1 second between when I saw the preparatory motion and when the emitter activated, was take a very slow breath and hold it, because I knew what the Alpha was going to do, and I did not want any involuntary sound from me to be part of what he read as the situation's context. I wanted him reading the cast, not me. That was the best outcome I could construct in the available time. The emitter activated. I did not smell it directly from the corridor. The barrier membrane filters most chemical signals in either direction, but I have been near active, cast pheromone delivery before, on a different station with a different species, and I knew the aversive profile it was designed to project. On the pack predators it was certified for, the response at this range and concentration would be a rapid withdrawal and a submission display, breaking the territorial formation and resetting the interaction dynamic in the cast handler's favor. On those species it would have worked. The Alpha moved. I am going to describe this to the board as precisely as I can, because the incident report uses language that I think overstates the violence and obscures the specificity of what the Alpha did. He crossed the distance from his central position to Rath-Ocel in what I would estimate as 1.5 seconds. He did not use his dew claws. He did not vocalize. The staccato aggressive pulse never appeared. What he used was mass and momentum and the specific anatomical leverage that the Vorrakh's six-limbed structure gives them at close quarters, leverage that humans and most bipedal species have no physical framework for, anticipating or countering because their bodies simply do not move that way. Rath-Ocel went from vertical to horizontal, off his feet and against the far wall of the pen, in a sequence of contact that I could follow with my eyes, but that my eyes reported as happening, faster than my brain could process in real time. He was not thrown. The Vorrakh do not throw. He was redirected. There is a difference, and the difference is why the medical report shows bruising consistent with impact and no puncture injuries and no fractures. The Alpha put him against the wall, with enough force to communicate his point clearly, and not enough force to damage what he was communicating to. The second colleague sat down on the pen floor. Drum was 4 feet from him, watching. The correct response, which the second colleague executed, was to hold very still, because when a Vorrakh pack member is 4 feet from you and watching you, very still is the answer to every question. Rath-Ocel was against the far wall. He was working on breathing, which I understand, because having an 800-pound animal redirect you into a wall does interesting things to the respiratory process, regardless of whether any bones are broken. He was not panicking. He was a professional, and professionals breathe through the recalibration. The third cast colleague had retreated to the observation corridor and was standing against the wall approximately 12 feet from Director Salos. The fourth cast colleague, who had been in the observation corridor from the start, had not moved. I respect people who read a situation accurately from the corridor and stay there. Director Salos was against the observation window. He had his ledger in both hands. He was not writing in it. The Alpha walked back to the center of the pen. He did not look at Rath-Ocel. He looked at the pen, at Kale, at Drum, at Thresh, at the barrier membrane, and then he made the status resolve tone. The brief drop and rise in the baseline rumble that I had come to understand as the pack equivalent of a concluded sentence. Then he walked back to his platform and climbed it. The entire pen interaction from Rath-Ocel's membrane entry to the Alpha, returning to the platform, had taken 7 minutes. The evaluation window had 8 minutes remaining. I walked from my position at the back of the corridor to the open membrane entry. I stopped at the threshold, and I did my 60-second stillness. Thresh, inside the membrane, held still with me. I could feel her warmth through the barrier surface, and then, when the 60 seconds were done and I stepped inside directly beside me, she moved the 2 feet to give me my entry space and then came back. Alongside me, pressing against my left side, the large warm mass of her, the subsonic low rumble that was her personal variant on the baseline, lighter and faster than the Alpha's. Kale moved from his pen position to the behind left shoulder position. Drum turned from where he had been watching the second cast colleague and faced the entry, covering the angle. I want to be clear, once again, to the board. I gave no command that produced this arrangement. I walked in and stood still, and the pack arranged themselves the way they had arranged themselves for the past 14 months when I entered the pen. I was not directing them. They were doing what they do. Rath-Ocel had found his feet. He was upright, one hand on the far wall, the other on his knee. He looked at me. His colleagues in the corridor were watching. Director Salos was still against the observation window with his ledger. Rath-Ocel looked at me. He looked at Kale behind my left shoulder. He looked at Thresh against my left side. He looked up at the Alpha on the platform, who was looking down at all of us with the amber arithmetic. And I watched Rath-Ocel's professional assessment of the situation arrive at its conclusion, which was a very different conclusion than the one he had arrived at when he walked into this corridor an hour earlier. I said, "Are you all right?" He said he was, in a tone of voice that I recognized as the specific flatness that a skilled professional uses when they are in the process of revising a significant number of their foundational assumptions. I said, "The pen is calm now. You can come out through the membrane, or you can hold your position against the wall. Either is fine. Take the time you need." He chose the wall for another 2 minutes. His breathing had normalized by the first minute. He was looking at the pack, specifically at the spatial arrangement of the pack relative to my position, and he was doing something with that information in the way that professionals do when they have been given data that their existing framework does not account for. His second colleague on the floor eventually stood, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has just had a very close-range education about Vorrakh spatial awareness, and walked to the membrane and out through it. Drum had lost interest and was watching the Alpha on the platform. Rithosel came out after his colleague. I stayed in the pen. I completed the feeding window. The pack ate. Thresh sat against my left side through most of it. Kale maintained his position behind my left shoulder, not eating until I began moving toward the entry membrane at the windows close, at which point he went and ate quickly, which I had observed before, and which I believed was his way of managing the conflict between the pack ritual of eating and his self-assigned position relative to me. The Alpha is always the one who eats last. Kale had apparently decided that he also ate last, after me. I did not know what to do with this information. I had been turning it over for several months. Drum ate and lay down in the center of the pen with his chin on his forelimbs, watching the entry membrane in the relaxed alert that the Vorrakh use when they consider the notable part of a situation resolved. The Alpha ate last, as he always does, and when he was done he descended from the platform, crossed the pen, and stopped 4 feet from me. I did not move. I looked at the space slightly above and to the left of his head. He made the chin-to-ground acknowledgement, the slow dip and hold that he had started doing at the 8-month mark, and that is not in any behavioral literature I have ever read, anywhere, applied to a non-Vorrakh individual. He held it for 3 seconds, then raised his head and looked at me with the amber arithmetic for another 2 seconds, and then he went back to the platform. I finished the feeding window. The 3 juveniles followed me to the entry membrane, as they always do, in their departure formation. Thresh first, Kale second, Drum third, each stopping at the threshold. This is not a behavior I shaped. I did not reward it, did not cue it, did not gradually introduce the concept of a departure ritual through any conditioning approach. It began around the 5th month and has been consistent since. My working theory is that it serves a pack social function. It is the pack confirming, at each window's close, that the individual who has been occupying their space is leaving under their own terms and not being forced out. In a natural Vorrakh pack context, an individual who leaves the pack's territory under their own will and is allowed to do so without pursuit has been granted a status classification that the Vorrakh literature calls passage right. I do not know if that is what the juveniles are doing when they walk me to the threshold. I know that every time I step outside the membrane and turn to look at them, they are stopped exactly at the boundary, not crossing, watching me go with the amber arithmetic, and that it does not feel like nothing. I stepped outside. The barrier sealed. Director Salos was in the observation corridor. The cast team was reassembled near the far entrance to the corridor. I walked to where the director was standing. He did not look at me when I arrived beside him. After a moment he said, "What just happened?" I told him the pack had assessed the cast team as an external challenge to the established hierarchy and had responded to that challenge in alignment with Vorrakh pack territorial defense behavior. The Alpha had resolved the contact without using his dew claws and without producing the aggressive vocalization pattern, which in my assessment indicated that he had not classified the cast as a serious threat, only as an incursion. That required a response. The pack had returned to behavioral baseline at the close of the window. The director said, "How did you get them to do that?" I said I had not gotten them to do anything. I had walked in at the end of the window and completed the standard feeding close, as I do at the end of every window. He said, "They arranged themselves around you." I said yes. He said, "Why?" I thought about how to answer this in a way that would be accurate and that he could do something with, and then I said, "Because they decided to." He looked at me for a while. He was a man accustomed to explanations that went somewhere operational, that connected a cause to a mechanism to an outcome that he could enter a ledger and act on. I had given him a fact that had no mechanism he could record. He did not like this. Rathosel came across the corridor and presented his preliminary assessment to Director Salos verbally, which I understood to be a professional courtesy extended ahead of the formal written report. He told the director that his team's methodology was not suited to the behavioral profile this pack had developed, that the pheromone contact approach had produced an adverse territorial response, indicating incompatibility with the pack's current social framework, and that he could not recommend proceeding with the behavioral modification protocol the director had outlined in the assessment brief. He said he would file a complete report within 72 hours, and that the report would note that the pack's current behavioral state appeared stable, and that the existing management approach appeared to be adequately maintaining that stability. He said this with the specific precision of a professional, delivering a conclusion that is accurate, that is defensible, and that will not be received well by the person receiving it. I have delivered conclusions in that register myself. It requires a particular kind of composure. The director received it badly. I will not detail his response at length because it is in the record order and the board has access to it. I will note that during the director's response, in which he expressed dissatisfaction with the assessment outcome and his intention to pursue further evaluation options, Rathosel stood very still and listened and said very little, which told me something about his character that the preceding 7 minutes in the Yomian pen had only partially demonstrated. A man who can be redirected into a wall by an 800-pound animal and then stand in a corridor 4 minutes later and receive a director's complaint with professional posture is not a small kind of person. After the director finished, Rathosel said he would have his written report filed within 72 hours and that he was available if the board had questions about his team's assessment. Then he and his team left the corridor. I stayed for a few minutes after everyone else had gone. The corridor lights were on their late afternoon cycle, lower, amber shifted, the way the station mimics a natural day even this far from any sun. Thresh was at the barrier membrane. I walked to her position and I pressed my hand flat against the membrane from the outside, which is not a contact protocol and is not in any manual. It is simply something I have done for about 10 months, because she does the nose press, and meeting the nose press with a hand press is, I do not know a technical word for it. I have thought about what word to use in this deposition, and the most accurate word I have is companionable. She pressed her nose against the inside of the membrane, against my hand, and held it. The warmth came through. Then I took my hand away and went and filed my incident report, which the board has in front of them now. I wanted to close this deposition by telling the board something that is observational rather than factual, and that I include because I believe it is relevant to the board's assessment of whether my management approach is appropriate for this posting. 2 days after the incident, Director Salos came to the observation corridor during a non-window period. No feeding, no scheduled observation, no staff in the ward. The barrier was sealed. I know this because I check the corridor monitoring logs every morning, which is part of my standard routine, and his presence at that time was logged. He stood at the observation window for approximately 12 minutes. I was not there. I learned the rest from the log. At the 12th minute, the Alpha descended from his platform. He crossed the pen. He positioned himself on the near side of the sealed barrier, directly across from where the director was standing, and he looked at him, not with the territorial challenge display, not with the chin-to-ground acknowledgement. The Alpha looked at him with a full amber arithmetic, the steady, continuous calculating attention, for approximately 40 seconds, and then, without any other behavioral signal, he went back to the platform and climbed it. The director left the corridor 2 minutes later. I do not know what the Alpha was doing exactly. I know that the Vorrakh make assessments about every individual who enters their environment. I know that those assessments are not static. They update continuously as new information becomes available. I know that the director had been in that corridor before, and that his behavioral pattern over the previous months had been logged by the pack the same way everything in their environment is logged. And I know that 2 days after the incident, the Alpha chose to come down from his platform and perform what I believe was a final assessment of an individual who had been attempting, for some time, to change the pack's circumstances. The director left 2 minutes later and, to my knowledge, has not returned to the observation corridor since. 3 days after the incident, Rathosel sent me a private communication, handler to handler, outside the formal report. He asked me what the chin-to-ground acknowledgement gesture meant. He said he had observed it twice during the closing segment of the feeding window, and had not found it in any reference material. He said he had reviewed the 3 published papers on Vorrakh behavioral taxonomy, and the Facilities Division supplement, and the 2 unpublished field notes from garrison handlers that circulate informally in large predator circles, and none of them described the gesture. He said he was asking because he wanted to understand what he had seen, and because the question was the kind that his professional record was not equipped to answer without help. I respected that. It takes a certain quality of person, after an incident like the one he had been through, to ask the question instead of filing the report and moving on. I told him my working interpretation, that the chin-to-ground gesture was the Alpha's way of indicating that he had made a complete assessment of an individual and found the accounting accurate, that he had looked at someone clearly, assessed their physical state, their behavioral pattern, their social positioning within the pack's environment, and had decided that what he saw was consistent with what was actually there, that there was no gap between the presentation and the reality. It is, I wrote, the closest thing I have found to a Vorrakh expression of respect, not the kind of respect that involves any power differential, not the respect a subordinate gives a superior, or that a prey animal gives a predator, the respect that one apex gives another when it has examined the other carefully and found it to be what it says it is. The chin-to-ground dip says, I have looked at you with everything I have, and you held up. You are what you are. I told Rath Ossel that the Alpha had performed the gesture for the first time toward me at the 8-month mark, and that I had spent the following week searching the literature for documentation and found nothing, and that I had eventually stopped looking and accepted it for what I believed it was. Rath Ossel's response came back the next morning. It said, I understand, and then, I would not go back in that pen. I wrote back, no, you probably shouldn't. What I did not write, and what I want to put in this deposition as my closing statement because it is what I actually believe, and because a review board seems like the right place to put the things you actually believe. The Vorrakh Alpha performed that gesture for Rath Ossel too. After the feeding window closed, when the pack had settled and I was moving toward the membrane, he came down from the platform and crossed the pen and stopped 4 feet from me and did the chin to ground, and then he went back. He does this at this end of some windows and not others, and I have not fully decoded the difference. But that day, he did it while Rath Ossel was still in the corridor, and could see into the pen through the membrane, and I believe, I cannot prove this, but I believe it, that the Alpha was doing it for an audience, that he was demonstrating clearly, for everyone present, what he was saying, and to whom he was saying it. I have been in this work for 31 years. I have been inside pens with animals that could have killed me on 100 separate occasions, across 8 stations, across 3 decades. I have been afraid. I've been hurt. I've been wrong about an animal's intentions and have learned the correction in ways I did not enjoy. I have also had the other thing, the thing that keeps people doing this work past the point where the pay justifies the risk, which is the experience of being inside a space with a creature that has made a genuine assessment of you and found you to be what you are, and the particular quality of stillness that follows from that. I am 52 years old. I have nowhere to be that is more important than this posting. I do not believe Director Silos has a basis for reassignment that this board will sustain. I believe the pack is stable, that the relationship I have with them is working, and that the working relationship is producing outcomes that a new handler would require at minimum another 14 months to rebuild. Assuming the pack allowed the rebuild to happen at all, which, given what happened in this incident, I would not assume. That is everything I have to tell you. I am available for questions for as long as the board requires. If the board would like to observe the pack directly before reaching their determination, I am available to take any member of this board to the observation corridor at any scheduled window time. I would advise against bringing more than 2 people into the corridor at once, and I would ask that no one use any pheromone delivery equipment or contact assertion protocols while in the corridor. Beyond that, you are welcome to come and see for yourselves what is in that pen. The board will form its own conclusions. That is correct and as it should be. I will only say this. The Alpha knows when someone has looked at him clearly, and he knows when someone hasn't. He is not confused about the difference, and he does not require a ledger to record his findings.